I never imagined that my day as a flight attendant would turn into a fight for survival at 10,000 meters in the air. One moment, I was guiding passengers, serving drinks, and managing the usual chaos of a full flight. The next, the cockpit went completely silent. No chatter, no instructions, just a terrifying emptiness that made my stomach drop. With 146 lives at stake, panic began to ripple through the cabin, and I realized that I might have to do something no one ever expects a flight attendant to do. That passengers looked at me for answers, their faces full of fear and confusion. Every second felt like an eternity as alarms blared faintly in the background. The captain's sudden silence wasn't just unusual, it was deadly. My mind raced. What caused the pilots to go unresponsive? Could I even handle what needed to be done? In that moment, I understood that this was no ordinary flight. It was a high-stakes situation where every decision mattered, and a single mistake could cost lives. I had to act, but what could I possibly do in a cockpit full of unknown dangers? And then, the unthinkable happened. As the minutes stretched on, the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than the cabin altitude ever could. I glanced at the passengers again, families clutching each other, a child gripping his mother's hand, elderly travelers whispering prayers. My training had prepared me for emergencies, but never like this. Never for the silence of a cockpit where the people who should have been in control were suddenly gone. I thought back to the morning before the flight. The crew had joked, the passengers had laughed, and everything had felt routine. Even the turbulence earlier seemed normal. But now, that normalcy was gone, replaced with a cold, heavy dread. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm, to appear composed for the passengers. Even while every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong, I edged closer to the cockpit door, hesitating. The alarms were faint, but growing in intensity, signaling that something critical was unfolding up there. My hands shook as I reached for the controls I'd only seen pilots touch. Could I really step into a role I'd never trained for? Could I make decisions that would determine the fate of 146 people? The questions swirled in my mind as a sudden jolt of turbulence shook the plane, and for a split second, I wondered if the next moment would be our last. I knew I couldn't just stand frozen. Passengers were starting to murmur, their fear tangible, and I could feel the tension building in the cabin like static electricity. I tried to reassure them, smiling and speaking calmly, but inside, my mind raced. Every scenario I'd ever learned in training suddenly felt insufficient. I was no pilot, yet here I was, facing a cockpit that had gone completely silent with 146 lives. Depending on what I did next, from the back of the plane, I could see a young mother rocking her baby, whispering softly to keep him calm. Nearby, a businessman gripped his briefcase like a lifeline, his knuckles white. Each face told a story, each story adding weight to my decision. I felt responsible for all of them, yet powerless without knowing what had happened in the cockpit. I remembered one of the co-pilots had mentioned a technical issue during pre-flight checks, something minor they had laughed off. Was it related? Or was this an unexpected medical emergency? My mind flicked through the possibilities as I debated whether to try opening the cockpit or attempt communication again. Every second mattered, and every decision felt monumental. As I leaned closer to the cockpit door, trying to steady my racing heart, a sudden warning light flashed across the panel, accompanied by a deafening alarm. The plane shuddered violently, and a cold fear gripped me. This was no ordinary crisis, it was spiraling fast, and there was no turning back. The alarms were screaming now, echoing through the cabin like a warning I couldn't ignore. The plane lurched again, sharper this time, and I grabbed the nearest seat to steady myself. Passengers screamed, clinging to each other as fear rippled through every row. I could feel the weight of every single life pressing down on me. 146 souls depending on someone who had never imagined stepping into the cockpit. I pressed my hand against the door, hesitating. Every instinct told me to wait for help, but deep down, I knew help wasn't coming fast enough. The thought of leaving everyone in the cabin vulnerable, trapped in a silent cockpit, was unbearable. I could almost hear the pilots' voices in my memory, guiding, commanding, protecting, and now, silence. A sudden jolt threw me against the panel, and warning lights flashed in chaotic rhythm. Oxygen masks dangled above, swinging slightly with the turbulence, a stark reminder of how high we were, how fragile our situation had become. I tried the intercom again, calling for any response from the cockpit. Nothing. Only the beeping of alarms and the panicked whispers of passengers. In that terrifying instant, I realized I had reached the point of no return. The plane tilted sharply to one side, and a wave of nausea hit me. I took a deep breath, gripping the controls near the cockpit door, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it would drown out everything else. The plane groaned under the strain, and I knew that the moment to act was coming whether I was ready or not. Just as I braced myself to open the cockpit door, the plane shuddered violently, throwing everyone forward. A sudden piercing alarm flashed on the overhead panel, one I hadn't seen before. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the pilots who were unresponsive. Something was seriously wrong with the plane itself. The intercom crackled, and a distorted, almost robotic voice came through. Engine failure. Rapid descent, imminent. I froze, the words echoing in my mind. Engine failure, at 10,000 meters, The calm hum of the flight had transformed into a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. Passengers screamed, children cried, and the cabin turned into chaos. Every second now felt like an eternity. I looked at the cockpit door again, heart hammering. My training didn't cover technical failures of this magnitude, yet I knew I had to do something fast. Sweat streamed down my face as I scanned the emergency manuals, flipping frantically through pages I had only glanced at before. Could I even attempt to take control, or was I about to make everything worse? Then, as if the situation wasn't dire enough, a sudden jolt made the plane tilt dangerously to one side. The oxygen masks fell fully into view, swinging above the terrified passengers. I realized the storm outside wasn't just turbulence, it was pulling us into something I couldn't yet see. And in that moment, I understood. Surviving this flight was going to demand more than courage. It was going to demand every ounce of instinct and quick thinking I had. I gritted my teeth and forced myself forward. Finally reaching the cockpit door, my hands shook as I twisted the handle, bracing for what I might find. To my relief and horror, the pilots were slumped over, unconscious but alive. The controls were within reach, but the plane was still plummeting. My training flashed through my mind in fragments: basic maneuvers, emergency procedures, instructions I had only ever practiced in simulations. With trembling hands, I keyed the radio, praying for guidance. A calm, authoritative voice responded almost immediately, guiding me through stabilizing the aircraft. Step by step, I followed the instructions, adjusting throttle and angle, struggling to keep the plane level. The passengers' screams slowly turned into murmurs of disbelief as they watched me work. Every adjustment mattered. Every second counted. Minutes stretched like hours. But gradually, the plane steadied. The alarms quieted. The turbulence eased, and a collective sigh of relief filled the cabin. I looked around at the passengers' faces, pale, eyes wide, but alive. 146 lives had been preserved by sheer will and determination. Just as I allowed myself a moment to breathe, the radio crackled again. "Ma'am, you've just landed us safely, but there's something you need to see on the main panel. You're not out of danger yet." My heart sank. The plane was stable, but the story wasn't over, and whatever awaited on that panel would change everything. I walked slowly to the main panel, still shaking, and saw the warning light that had sent my heart racing. It was a minor hydraulic issue that had triggered a cascade of alarms. The engineer's voice over the radio explained it calmly, but I could hardly believe how close we had come to disaster. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a deep exhaustion that settled in my bones. Passengers began to clap quietly, some teary-eyed, others hugging each other tightly. I walked back through the cabin, offering smiles and reassurances, though inside, I was still processing the magnitude of what had happened. A young boy ran up to me, clutching a small toy airplane, and whispered, "Thank you for saving us." That simple act reminded me why I had chosen this job, why being alert, calm, and brave mattered more than I could ever have imagined. Later, on the ground, emergency crews checked the plane, and the pilots recovered, dazed but safe. I realized that courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about taking action when fear threatens to freeze you. That day, I had stepped into a role no one expected, and 146 lives were changed forever. And though the flight was over, the lessons I learned about responsibility, instinct, and human resilience would stay with me forever.